Good evening, everyone. We start our study anew with the book of Leviticus. The book of Leviticus, as in the names of the English Bible that is used in the translation, are names that are adopted from the Greek and Latin names. In the Hebrew, they don't call this book Leviticus, but they call this book Vayikra. So I'll just add it in here so that we can see what it means. It is Vayikra. Vayikra comes from the expression here, and cold. And basically what we have are these words in the Hebrew. Anyways, this is the word and or and then. He called. So Vayikra literally means and then he called. And it is actually the first word of this book. And that is how the name is given to the book of Leviticus in the Hebrew. Now, what is important as by way of introduction is that we need to realize that we have the book of Exodus. And the book of Exodus talks about the Exodus from Egypt, Mount Sinai, receiving the law, and the instructions that were given as to how exactly to prepare the tabernacle of God and the instruments that goes inside the tabernacle of God. Now, after the book of Exodus, at least in the arrangement of the Bible, you find the book of Leviticus comes about, but that is not in a chronological fashion. The next book should really be the book of Numbers from a historical perspective. It's the book of Numbers, and the book of Numbers goes down to the end of the 40th year. And so we have from the book of Exodus, from chapter 13 onwards, we have the first year. And somewhere in the book of Numbers, in chapter 13, that would be sometime around 1.5 years thereafter of the Exodus. Now, basically, what I'm trying to highlight to you is that we need to be aware of the chronology, that there is a lot happened in the first 1.5 years. By chapter 13, they were supposed to go into the promised land, but they didn't. And so what happened was that they were then caused to wander in the wilderness up to the year 40. And from there onwards, we will have the book of Deuteronomy, which would be the last few months of the life of Moses, to review with the second and third generation of the Israelites before they enter into the promised land. And so the book of Leviticus is not in a chronological order. It tells us that for our purposes today, that the book of Leviticus should sometime be in the book of Numbers. In the book of Numbers before chapter 13, but after chapter 4. The reason that it was done that way is for us to understand that there were a number of things that is told to us by way of an evidence, because it says here, Jehovah God called to Moses, and this word is and then, spoke to him from inside the tabernacle of meeting. If it is inside the tabernacle of meeting, we do know that Numbers chapter 1 talks about setting up the tabernacle. So it has to be sometime in the book of Numbers. And so bear in mind that the book of Leviticus is not a chronological order, but it is an important what we call the law of the priests, the Kohen, and what they need to know in order to conduct themselves for the sake of the children of Israel in the tabernacle of meeting. Now, for our purposes in this study, I would like to introduce to you a number of Hebrew words because these are Hebrew words which mean something in Hebrew, but in the English as a translation may have lost some of its meaning in the translation itself. We will begin with the tabernacle of meeting. Why do we call that the tabernacle of meeting? You have to go back into the book of Exodus. The Hebrew name is Ohel, which means tent. And that is also the reason why you find in some of the English translations, they use the word tent instead of tabernacle. The second part is appointment. Appointment here is moed. And this is important because in Genesis chapter 1, on day 4, when God appointed the sun, moon, and stars for specific purposes, one of those purposes was this word moed, for a meeting, as in appointment. I use the word appointment because it's more of a modern concept, but it's a meeting at an appointed time. That's what moed means. It's a meeting, but it's a meeting at a specific time that God has allotted. And so in our modern day, when those of us who are in, say, business meetings, for example, you would set up a meeting with a client at a very specific time, a specific date, a specific day, and a specific place. And at that specific time, you meet with the client. Now, this is exactly the same meaning for meeting. It is an appointment, but it gives us an imagery of a place. So let me just put this down that we need to bear in mind. It is about a place and it is about a time. And by time, it is about a day of month in the year. And that's what day 4 is supposed to be. On the 7th month of the year, on the 10th day of the month, those are appointments. And that is what meetings is all about. The book of Vayikra, or Seder Vayikra, or the book of Leviticus, as we see here, sometime in this period of time, it is what we call God's rules. So let me just put this down as well. It is God's house, God's rules. Now, what does that mean? God's house, God's rules means this. The tabernacle of meeting is not something that we are familiar today. Our approach in the book of Leviticus is not particularly to read this specifically for, say, a Jew today. We are here to read the book of Leviticus as an observer, a non-Jew, in the place of a Jew trying to understand what is being said and how it is being understood by the children of Israel. Because these are God's rules for his house. At this point in time, his house is an ohel, a tent. Later on in the book of First Kings, in chapter 7, we find Solomon building the house of God, and that would be a more permanent structure, which we call the temple. And it is no longer referred to as ohel. It is referred to as another word. It is a different word to refer to the temple. And so ohel is only useful for us before the construction of the temple. So at this point in time, we just need to bear in mind that tabernacle is ohel, meeting is moed. So it is actually ohel moed, tabernacle of meeting, an appointment with God, with a specific place, which is wherever the tabernacle is placed. The time is wherever God has said. But at this point in time, for our purposes in the book of Vayikra or the book of Leviticus, it is now. At this point in time, God called to Moses. Maybe he called out his name, Moses, Moses. Where was Moses? And so this is where we also need to spend just a little bit to understand. The tabernacle is somewhat like the temple. There is the sanctuary and there is the holiest place. The holiest place, or what people commonly call the Holy of Holies, is a very sacred place that nobody can go in, except for the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. However, what is in the holiest place is because it is a place where God's Ark of the Covenant is, and the presence of God sits on top of the Ark of the Covenant above the cover. And we will talk about this as we go along. And that in itself depicts that location, meaning this particular location here, is called the holiest place because God's presence is there in its actual form. And so God will call to Moses from inside the Holy of Holies in the ohel, the tabernacle. Now, where was Moses? Moses can be anywhere on the outside and at most inside the sanctuary. Can Moses go into the sanctuary? And the answer is yes, because Moses is part of the Levites. But besides that, he cannot, by rule, go into the holiest place unless God calls for him. So he is about the only one that we know that can go in besides Aaron, the high priest. And so this is the picture that we're given. Now, in the book of Exodus, we have already seen that God has been speaking to Moses, calling to Moses at the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, calling him up to Mount Sinai in Exodus chapter 19. And this will be the third major time after the tabernacle has been set up, God calls to Moses. So let us continue. He says, speak to the sons of Israel. It's actually called sons of Israel, Bnei Israel, and say this to them. So what we are seeing is this. God speaks to Moses, and Moses communicates to the sons of Israel. That has been the strategy or the protocol because God has chosen Moses to be the mouthpiece. And that is why oftentimes Moses is also called the prophet of God. Now, in the book of Exodus, God made Moses Elohim to Pharaoh, and Aaron became the prophet of Moses, because Moses has a certain speech impairment. And so that was the role that was crafted out. However, towards the children of Israel, both Moses and Aaron continues that role. Speak to the children of Israel, say this to them. Then we are seeing a lot of things that God is saying to Moses, and that Moses have recorded it down, and it's passing on to the sons of Israel. Now, how does that fit with God's house, God's rules? In an Eastern Oriental culture, for example, in your various homes, each person has your own house rules. Whether you wear the shoes into the house, or you leave the shoes outside the house, or if you have, say, a pair of slippers to be worn inside the house. And when a guest is inside the house, there are some unspoken rules that you don't go wandering in the house to places where it's not considered public area. So you don't wander into people's bedrooms, for example. And if you were needing to go to the washroom, you ask for their permission whether they would allow and show you where to go. So these are what we call house rules. Your house, your rules. But today, in the book of Leviticus, it is God's house. And so it is God's rules. That is what I mean, because the Hebrew people is an Eastern Oriental people, and the practices are very similar to our own practices even today. And so when God instructed Moses to tell the sons of Israel how and what to do in building the tabernacle or the Ohel Moed, after they have fitted it, it is according to God's rules and God's ways and God's architecture. And when it's put up in Numbers chapter 1, then you find that we have the house ready. The Ark of the Covenant is really inside the holy place, and God's presence in the form of a cloud comes above the cloud inside the tent. It's symbolic above the tent itself, but fundamentally it would be inside the Holy of Holies, sitting on the Ark of the Covenant. Now, the reason why it is so important for us to understand this is called God's house is because God's presence abides in the tent. And so the idea of house is not just a physical structure, it is also a locality that describes and provides for the presence, and in this case, the presence of God. In normal case, people will have a tent and they would dwell in tents. And so God's tent is like God's house. He lives there, and so in his tent, he will have rules for people who can come, who cannot come, and if you come, what you ought to be doing. And this is what I mean by God's rules. Speak, tell the children of Israel and say these things to them. And what is recorded as we go on would be what God is saying to Moses. In this next phrase, we see this. When any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. Now, we're not going to do the entire chapter today. We will break at this verse as part of our introduction, but suffice for us to understand what are the rules of God. It is this. When any one of you brings an offering, now this word brings, literally, it means approach the Lord with an offering. So the word brings an offering actually hides the purpose. Why do people actually come to God's house? Why do people actually come to the tabernacle? It is not about just bringing an offering, it is now drawing near to God. And so this word bring carries the connotation of approaching, cause oneself to come near. So basically, if this is the tabernacle, it would be bring, cause somebody to come near God's house. And when you come near God's house, it is symbolic of coming near God, Jehovah. And when they come to this place, they should be bringing an offering. And in this case, an offering here comes from the Hebrew word korban. Now, you may have seen these words in Arabic or in Malay. Korban actually means an offering. An offering is a gift. All right, it's a gift. It is a present. It is something that you present to God. And so when you present something to God, that is a present. And so you shall bring your offering. And so this idea of bring your offering is you shall approach with your korban of the livestock. Now, this word livestock is behemoth, of the animals in your fold. In this case, animals that you have kept as part of your shepherding. That would be the word here. And the verse actually breaks here. So it is not an error. There is a break here. When you come to God, when you approach God with a korban, a gift, then you should bring it from your bunch of animals that you have. What does that mean? It means this: by clarity, it comes from your zone. The zone would be the small cattle, the small cattle and the big cattle. Well, the first one is bakar. These are the large animals. These are the small animals. So let me explain. What are the large animals that the Israelites will be keeping? The large animals, the bakar, will be things like cattle, the ox, the oxen, the bigger animals that they use for the meat or the agriculture. These will be the large four-legged animals. And what about the flock? No, these would be the smaller ones, say the goats, the sheep, the rams. Right? And then that would be the smaller four-legged. Of course, when they grow big, they could be quite big as well. But these would be what we call livestock in this case. Now, what is going to be clearer when we go on in the rest of this chapter is that korban cannot be a wild beast. Means this: if there was a wild oxen, it wasn't part of your flock, it doesn't count. And that is why it says God's rules. It literally means it's God's rules. It is for the Israelites that they are to respect God's house. In today's terminology, it would be like the king's palace. You cannot go to the king's palace unless you observe the king's protocol. And so God's rules will be God's protocol. What he expects, what he wants done if you were ever to go into or come near to approach God. That is the whole purpose of the book of Leviticus, the Vayikra. Primarily, these are laws that everyone should know, but how to execute them would be very much the Kohen, the priests. And so we need to understand at this point in time that as we read through the book of Leviticus, you will find that the rules that we are told that we can read from are what I would call high level outlines. If you are familiar with writing a book, for example, or writing a report, the headers, the top lines, or the first line to explain your main themes, they do not contain very much detail. And so all of these that we read in the book of Leviticus as God's rules are given as an overview, as an outline, whereby they are recorded down as what we call the written Torah. There are a lot of issues that we will not be able to know how to do some things because it is not specified in its actual details. The Jews call that the oral Torah, the oral tradition whereby Moses would have instructed the Kohen, the other people of what more they must know that is not recorded in the written Torah. Now, these are things that we need to be very clear because by reading the book of Leviticus, one cannot do anything about it because we have not enough detail to do things. And so the oral traditions are the ones that mix the rules to be more clear, to be more detailed, to be more succinct. When they actually come into the tabernacle, what exactly are they doing? And only they would know. The rest of the people gets to hear it. They understand the gist of it, but exactly how it needs to be done, then the Kohen and the Levites will have more of these instructions. And that is why the oral tradition is so important to the people at large. And then that oral tradition, obviously, beyond the tabernacle and the temple rules, there have been more oral traditions that has been captured along the way. So for now, for our purposes in studying the book of Leviticus, just bear in mind that everything we read in this book gives us a gist, a feel. We can see the heart of God. We can see the character of God, but we will never see all the details that needs to be practiced because it is the Kohen, the priest, that is supposed to be overseeing the actual details. And so as we come back to the livestock, the word livestock, this will be how the Kohen would understand it. That when you come and draw near to God and you bring a present, a korban to God, a gift to God, you cannot have found the animal there in the wild. That is the answer here. And so if it is not from the larger flock, the larger herds, or the smaller animal flocks, then they are not part and parcel of the protocol that God is explaining, if that is the case. And so this is what, as we enter into the book of Leviticus, we need to bear in mind what is said, what is not said, but can be inferred from the text. So that when we read the text, we are more enlightened as to how we should approach the book of Leviticus. We want to understand the book of Leviticus as an Israelite who is sitting there hearing from Moses, but we are not hearing the oral traditions. We are only hearing what is said in this written Torah. And even by understanding the written Torah, it is passed down to people like ourselves that we, when we examine this book, can actually see God's character. He is giving us the rules to tell us that his house is sacred. His house cannot be messed with. It is his house, just like we have our houses, respectively. Nobody will tell us what to do with our houses, much less if it's the house of God. It will be God to tell them what to do. At this juncture, I hope that we can see that the majesty of God, the importance of God, the house of God really belongs to God. And anyone who approaches God, that would be at the Ohel Moed, will have to comply to all the rules of God, or what we call protocols today. There are positive protocols, there are negative protocols, but nevertheless, it is God's house, it is God's rules. I hope that we bear this in mind. God's people, God's rules. If they want to be called God's people, they have to follow God, their Elohim. And so they have to do what God tells them to do. That's the concept that we are painted all through the Torah, from book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, now that we're in this, so that we understand the overriding, most important person in these books that we have examined, particularly now in the book of Leviticus, is not Moses. It is Jehovah God. And it is him who is going to tell us what he wants. And from what he wants done, we can actually examine how God is like. Let me close by giving us an example. We get to know God by what he says and what he do. A person, like for example, a potential employer who is interviewing a person, say yourself, would actually go for an interview. And in that interview, the potential employer would actually ask you if you could introduce yourself and tell him a little bit about yourself, but more importantly, to tell him what you have done and how you do things. It is from your actions, your behavior, your spoken and unspoken words that will tell the employer the kind of person you are. And so when we examine the book of Leviticus, we are also having to take that posture, observe what God says, how he says it from the Hebrew, why he says it, and then we can capture the mind and heart and the character of God. And that is our whole purpose of this study, so that we can know the God of the Bible a little better from the book of Leviticus. And with this, by way of introduction, we will continue from verse 3 all the way to the end tomorrow. And with this, we come to the end of our session today.